All right, welcome everyone. This is episode 3 of the ACL Hub. I've got a very special guest today, Mr. Matt Whalan, Dr. Matt Whalan. He probably doesn't like being called doctor, but he's done a PhD, so he rightfully deserves it. And he's a fellow bald man and an amazing human being and a very smart man. So Matt, welcome to the ACL Hub, and sharing some of your words of wisdom and experience with us today.
That's a very, very kind introduction there, Mick. I'll take that one.
Well, there's probably not many people who know you, but I will give you a quick pump up of your tires and correct me if I'm wrong. I've got a little bio here that I found, but you're a physiotherapist, obviously, researcher, sports scientist, and you've contributed a lot to injury prevention in Australia, but not only Australia, but all across the world. You've done a PhD on injury prevention, and you're currently working within Football Australia as the player availability and perform coordinator. And you and yourself and some of your mates have got together and put together the Perform Plus program, which has been a wonderful resource. And currently the lead physio for the Socceroos, and you've worked with the Olyroos before, and very busy man. Own a clinic in Wollongong, probably a couple of clinics in Wollongong. So you've got a lot of things spinning, a lot of wheels spinning. Have I forgotten anything?
Just I'm lead physio with the Matildas, but have worked
Matildas,
with the
sorry,
Socceroos.
Matildas. Yep.
And with the women's national teams at the moment, which is a
Yep.
great privilege and something just started this year.
Yeah, mate, fantastic. And yeah, we were talking off air before. Female sport is booming across the world, but Australia, especially, and no bigger sport that is front of the viewers' eyes, I think, and getting bumps on seats than football, as it's known in the world game, but soccer here in Australia and the US. So, mate, yeah, it must be an exciting time to be involved in the sport.
Yeah, I think the women's game. I think Australia was probably an early adopter into women's sport, and there's been a lot of probably decent support compared to other countries for the women's team for a while, and now the other countries are starting to take notice. And obviously, since the 2023 World Cup, there's been a lot more probably attention as opposed to the players have been performing at quite high levels for a long period of time, but it's quite a unique scenario where we have such a large number of our players playing in the top 1 to 2, 3 leagues in the world, and
Yep.
like probably highlighted by 4 of our players in the Champions League semi-finals, the UEFA Champions League semi-finals, which is
Yep.
such a phenomenal achievement for them. So very, very fortunate and privileged to work with such a talented group of players and athletes,
Mm.
and people, to be honest, and then also around the other staff involved in that space. So
Yep.
it's
Yeah.
exciting time.
No, awesome, mate. Congratulations on the new gig and the progression in your career. It's having known you for a while. You've been involved at both junior level, both men and women, and now more senior level men and women. And having this particular platform, the ACL Hub, is trying to sort of get the world's best clinicians, researchers, academics, but also to bring athletes to front of the stage as well, like to get their perspective on things. The first one I interviewed was Lynn Snyder-Macklow, who really sort of drove home the importance of early quads work, and we want to get little bits of expertise along the way, and yours really diving into injury prevention. Like I think everyone, it'd be lovely, to prevent all ACL injuries. We know we can't reduce all ACL injuries, and it'd be lovely too. But we know we have to accept that they will happen. Our role really as health professionals and clinicians and sports scientists and everyone involved in sport, our role is really trying to mitigate that risk as best as possible. And you being heavily involved, and you developed the Perform Plus program here in Australia, and being a really strong voice for injury prevention. What have you, I guess, seen over the years in both men's and women's, juniors and seniors? What have you kind of seen evolve in the last probably 10 to 15 years, in terms of, I guess, injury prevention programs? If we just sort of look at maybe adoption, has the adoption of these programs that are available, not only football, because you probably have looked at other sports like netball and you've been involved in other things clinically, but across the board, what are you seeing change over the last 10 to 15 years?
Yeah, I think that it's such a So injury prevention, as it sounds, it's a very simple sort of phrase, but it's quite a
Mm.
complex process. And I
Mm.
think we end up, and I've been guilty of it over, so I've been working now for 20 odd years, and probably for the last 12 really tried to push down a prevention sort of framework. And I guess it started with the whole concept of let's reduce all injuries. And so we then use language like prevention, but that's a very absolute thing. It's just like nothing happens.
Yep.
But then we play sports where things are likely to happen, or there's scenarios where something can we there's an inherent risk as soon as you walk onto the field. And we kind of then went to this injury risk reduction concept of like let's just reduce risk, but we and then almost throwing out prevention. I probably now sit with much more that injury prevention is our philosophy. If we steal things from public health, where like in Australia, we have the roads and traffic campaigns around towards zero, like a towards zero ACL injuries makes sense to me. Like, so we're
Yeah.
going to do everything we possibly can to reduce the risk of someone having it. And I think the key thing for people, what I've learned and what becomes clear is that there's the layers of what we're trying to do within the prevention framework. So something like, say, the FIFA 11 plus, or which became the 11 plus, which we've probably created a new model of it, like hasn't really of the Perform Plus. The whole goal of that is that it's something that everybody does. So it's like the vaccine kind of concept. It's population focused. If you're going to do something, then this is something you can do. I think what I have seen over the last 10 years is a lot more strength work is
Mm.
becoming, or gym work is becoming an acceptable part of football. I used to always, because I've worked in rugby league and AFL and things as well. And rugby league, you always used to have a joke that you couldn't get the players out of the gym onto the field. When football, you couldn't get the players off the field into the gym. But I think there's still a long way to go in the football space, both in men's and women's around gym
Mm.
work.
Yep.
But I think it becomes down to then what I've probably learned the most is how we communicate our message is really important. Like we often go, because it makes sense to us. If you get stronger, there's less likely bad things to happen. But
Yep.
then we've got to then work out how that lands in terms of training versus soreness and people's perceptions of gym and those sorts of components. So we
Yep.
know that if you do something like the Perform Plus, the 11 Plus program, like neuromuscular kind of control programs that involve strength, that you're likely to reduce the risk of all injuries by at least 40%. Like that's pretty
Yep.
consistent across most of the
Yep.
research. And ACL injuries, especially in the women's space, like most of the strongest research is in that female space, you can reduce the risk of injury by about 2/3, so
Yeah.
66%. And that's just doing something 2 to 3 times a week. And it's a pretty much an off the shelf, if you're going to bake your cake, it's a packet mix
Yep.
off the shelf.
Yep.
So it's the hardest part then is getting enough people aware of it, then getting them educated in it, getting organizations to fund it.
Yep.
Probably the best example we've seen is things in New Zealand. So, and also in Sweden. Sweden do a great job in this space. And what we've tried to almost look at from an Australian version is the New Zealand and Sweden become, because of the populations, they're a little bit smaller, so they're almost like
Yeah.
pilot countries for how you could do it. But to be honest, like there's still a long way to go and a lot of work to do
Yeah.
in it. We have some good evidence that if you do implement these programs, then for every dollar that's invested, you can save around $4 in terms of cost down the line for every ACL you
Yeah.
prevent.
Wow.
So there's actually a good return on investment component. The hardest part though is investing in prevention. If it works, then nothing happens. So it's really hard for people to
Yeah.
get a tangible, to go to governments and ask for money for something that
Yep.
to prevent something from happening. It
Yep.
actually becomes quite a tricky thing. So I think I've become less probably. Not grumpy might be the right word, but like you get less frustrated because it is just a complex process that we
Yep.
have to keep skin in the game. We have to keep arguing for it and just keep arguing for the simple things.
Yep.
But also being less absolute, because I think as
Yep.
researchers,
Yes.
we often go, no, it has to be 3 times a week, it has to be 2 times a
Yep.
week. But and then it feels like we're a closed shop and someone will go, but I don't want to do a Nordic hamstring curl. I want to do this exercise instead. It's like, yeah, so I guess from my
Yep.
end, I've become more of a do something
Yep.
and try and get the compliance in and get the dose in, and then we can try and build the culture and it becomes a behavior type of process as opposed to being prescriptive. And
Yep.
probably, I know I'm probably rambling, but I think probably my biggest learning is becoming more coach based rather than prescriptive based,
Yes.
and
Yep.
understanding that going, my 3 sets of 10 aren't the essential part. potentially. So if someone's not going to do the exercise at all, or they have to do 3 sets of 10, I'd rather them do 3 sets of 4,
Yes.
and then we eventually get that compliance component up.
Yep.
So that's probably my main components from our end.
Yeah. Oh, that's great perspective, and I think that's what I love about that is, like you certainly have seen the evolution of strength that's being more accepted, both males and females. The massive drops, the 40% drop in all types of injuries, 60 up to 66% of ACL injuries in females, 2 to 3 times a week. But that's with the off the shelf stuff. Like that's where people who are young clinicians, early career sports trainers, early career exercise physiologists, young physios who are trying to get skin in the game and that sports physio experience. Even if you aren't that very well equipped for exercise prescription yet, because you haven't gone into deep dives yet in your career and you haven't done a level 1 ASCA course or an S&C course and you don't know quite yet, that's where their programs are beautiful, because you just basically take it off the shelf, you get your recipe and you apply it. And I think that's where the beauty stands with those programs. But then also too with time and I guess experience is where your kind of expertise is shining through, is that being adaptable, I think, is really key. And as you get older, it probably means that you have to sort of shy away from those recipes and being really, this has to be done. This is a black and white program and has to be done like this. That's where I think time and knowledge and experience and a bit of age, really shines through, because you have to be adaptable. There'll be some clubs that have got absolutely zero resources. So, you won't have the luxury of, doing 3 sets of 10 deadlifts, or 3 sets of 10 knee extensions, or 3 sets of 10 squats with a 30 kilo bar. There'll be absolutely zero, resources to do that. So you're going to have to find ways to get that stimulus into the body. I think that's a really nice message there, in that, you probably start off early being a bit more recipe based, but I think as your time goes on and as you've learned through your career, you probably have become a little bit more fluid and a little bit more, leaning into being, I guess, adherent and compliant to things, rather than being absolutely, hard and fast and black and white with your prescription. Moving on to, like you alluded to before, about your work with the Perform Plus program. What are some of the core principles you've seen, or what are some of the core principles brought into the Perform Plus that differ from that original 11 plus program, or the FIFA 11 plus? What are you and Stella and the rest of the crew done differently there in that space, I guess, to bring it into a 2025 standard of care for our footballers and soccer players?
Yeah, so the genius of the original FIFA 11 plus, and the 11 plus itself, was that what they did was they kind of hijacked a normal part of training. So we knew that there was certain exercises that were, if you're going to pick one exercise, for example, to reduce hamstring injuries, there was decent evidence, say, for a Nordic hamstring curl that can do that. Not to say that's the only exercise, but if you're going to pick one, that's what we would do. And so some proprioceptive stuff, some landing work, those sorts of things. So what the guys at FIFA did at that time, so Mario Bazzini, Holly Silvers, Grinelli, Yuri Dvorak, like, they managed to go, well, the warm-up is a place here, and we could actually like sneak things in to that space. And it was really like very clever what they did, and they had some really good investment behind them. And so, but then what we found, like over time, like we knew it was effective, but the compliance was tricky, because if you've ever tried to run the program, it can take 25-30 minutes to run the first time, then it gets a bit quicker over time. There was some components around, and if this was community focused, so if you've only got a 1 hour session, then doing that, so it was hard to get some buy-in from coaches and things. So what we did, we actually split the program into 2, and so there was a running component to the program, and then there's a strength-based program. And what we did, we shifted the strength-based component to the cool down. So we just extended the common theme, which was like take a normal part of training. But rather than sinking it all into the warm-up, we put it into the cool down component. So then we could actually we unlocked it from a warm-up only program to just a normal training program. And then with Stella Fyth's work, so she did some really great work with the Sydney FC Academy. And what we looked at is, if you did the strength-based part, which is part 2 or part B, of the program, then if you did that at home versus at the end of training, was there any difference between compliance? And we're talking about like Australian elite academy players, so they're obviously quite motivated. But And what we found was there was no difference in strength gains. Like they all gained strength, they all reduced injuries the same. So that gave us also another way to go, look, potentially it doesn't matter whether you do the strength work at training or whether you do it at home, let's just get the dose in. So what we tried to do with the program is we stayed true to the original concept of the parts, and the poster looked very similar, and the framework. So it's pretty much like you look at the original iPhone versus where the iPhone gets to now. Like it's the same kind of concept, but just a bit more just modernized, I guess. And we also added a groin specific or adductor specific exercise, the Copenhagen exercise, into there as well. So we actually just took the framework and managed around that. So the other part we also did was we created more of a system around the Perform Plus. So if you go onto the Football Australia Perform Plus, Football Australia website, the Perform Plus sits there, which is a big important component as well. So there's agency within Football Australia around that. But there's also components around tips for coaches how to implement the program. So and also within that, maintaining enough all the other factors, so high speed running volume, making sure the training load's appropriate. And then we have a youth-based component too around what to do with the younger athlete and things to be aware of. But also then around the female athlete as well. So in terms of, what are the special considerations or the missing pieces of where we were to where we need to be in the female space? So, for example, the original 11 plus was targeted for 12-year-old players, which is probably more marked around the peak height velocity age of a male player. Whereas realistically, in the female player, maybe we should be starting this in the 10-year-old age group. So, so I think a lot of that becomes then the program is part of the system. It's not just the thing. And again, it's not to make it overly complicated. And that's the fine line here, is something really complicated like injury, but even more complicated like ACL injury, is to not overly simplify it, but also to provide simple tools that people can then pick and choose what they want to do. So the key was to improve compliance, and part of my PhD work was about, if we move the part to the strength work to the end of training, can we improve compliance, which we showed a 33% improvement in compliance if we did it at the end of training. We know the other component for us was to make sure we didn't stuff up the original, the program had pretty high efficacy previously. We need to make sure we sustain that. So we're able to do that. So I think, and I know what's been probably the most pleasing for me is from an impact, like the Swedish program, the knee program has now got a knee plus program, which has, again, the strength work's been unlocked to the end of the training session. So I think that's probably the component I'm happiest and probably proudest about, is that we've continued to advance things. Little old Australia has managed to continue to add information that we can then try and make everyone's experience of football safer, or sport safer, really.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant. And I love how you're learning, like anything, like all good scientists, you kind of have hypothesis and you sort of got an idea of what's working, what's not working. And it's like, okay, well, these programs for 11 plus, like you said, it took a long time, 20 minutes at the start of a session, sometimes even more, 25 minutes to go through point A to point, and then fill in your tactical stuff and your technical stuff. Like, for a community level coach, that's a lot of time I would rather spend doing other things. So to break it up into, basically get the running done first and hit the ground running, so to speak, and then finish your strength work when it either can be done at training, or you can just take that home and do it with you at home. And being done a couple of times a week, like that adaptability, I love. I'm much a man who lives in the grey. I'm not a type A personality at all, who needs to be sort of doing things by the letter, by the repetition or anything like that. So I think that's probably one key message here. There's for the young junior clinician here listening, and health professional, even patient listening, is that what I'm sort of taking home from Matt here is making sure that things are being done within a 7-day period. It probably doesn't matter so much for the vast majority of things, but as long as they're getting done, a couple of times a week, that's where we're seeing our biggest reductions in injury. I think historically, some of the barriers to these programs have been, poor time, which has probably sort of enabled you to shift things around to open up time to the coaches and that kind of stuff. Is that kind of been one of the big barriers that you've seen over your years in adopting for teams and players and coaches to adopt these programs, Matt? Or are there, and if so, are there any other major barriers that you've seen that create these challenges for the 11 plus Perform Plus to be adopted?
I think if we look at it from a community lens, so if like in a sub-elite sort of space, most of it's around the coaches is normally the deliverer as well. So, and those coaches can be volunteers or mums and dads, and it's normally partly around literacy and knowing it's there, but also then going, well, this is just another thing I have to do. So that's why we've tried to push it as like a parents component as well.
Yep.
So I think we've got a lot of work to do to still continue to around awareness. Like we managed to get these programs into coach education platforms. So when people do their coaching courses, now that there is education around the Perform Plus. But we also need to, what we want to do is do a lot more education modules, like similar to like a first aid course where we can actually get those things out, but also use that as a vehicle to include things like heat policies in Australia and concussion policy. So more a holistic sort of focus. So I think there's the knowledge of these programs is still tricky, and probably one of the things that I've seen, like I feel like I bang on about this program all the time. So you just probably stop after a while, but then you realize that there's people that haven't heard about it, so that's fine as well.
Yes.
So
it's
crazy.
It's sometimes disturbing. Like, I've working clinically now, I see a number of teenage athletes around. I work. My son plays soccer. He's been involved in the local soccer clubs here in Townsville for the last couple of years. I coached his first under sixes and under sevens year. And in terms of me knowing a little bit about injury prevention programs and being probably a good physio, we went through warm ups. We probably didn't follow the 1 plus or the 11 plus to the letter for a bunch of 6-year-olds, but the components were there. I wanted them to run. I wanted them to hop and to jump and direction. We'd do that for 10, 15 minutes before we actually got into some skill-based work. So I would do that. But speaking to other parents, and there are many clubs in under sixes and under sevens around town, and watching some of the other clubs train on a Thursday afternoon, a lot of, and speaking to other parents, they had no idea about the FIFA 11, and that's just a very small sample of mums and dads here in Townsville. You could take that and multiply it, thousand times, club and city around Australia. There'd be so much, I guess, unawareness, if that's a word, around Australia, at mum and dad level. It's an important level. Our amateur clubs and our semi-elite clubs and our professional clubs and the people associated around those clubs will have good understandings of these programs. They'll have that ingrained, and it'll be part of like their Monday to Friday kind of setup. But it's going to be your school-based programs, your mums and dads who have been sort of bestowed a coaching role because they were the only person to turn up to sign-up day, and now they're the ones that still have got absolutely no idea. So it's absolutely mind-boggling. So I could understand that. That's a pretty big barrier to try and overcome.
And I think one of the things we've tried to do is demedicalize the concept. So, and I think in fairness, when you talk to coaches will go, "Oh, it's injury stuff, so therefore it's not my stuff," and that's perfectly reasonable. And it's probably one of the biggest things of like this is a communication process of, okay, the benefit is if you do the program, especially the strength work, you'll perform better. We know there's good evidence that you'll get stronger, you'll get faster. I would like there is some evidence that says that people get fitter, but I'd be surprised if people actually do get fitter from doing the program. But I think, and you'll have more players available, so you can actually that's why we changed the name to Perform Plus. Was because it's purely around performance. Because the more players you have available, you're going to perform better. The stronger you are, you'll perform better. So I think part of it was to demedicalize it. And even my title within Football Australia is not around injury prevention. It's around player availability. So it's just a spin into a language that coaches, I would often say understand, but that sounds condescending, but it's just speaking coaches' language around we're part of our whole goal. If we're successful, there's just that players are on the field and they're going really well. So we're actually coming at it from the same angle, but changing that culture around injuries, medical, then we've just got to be aware that that's often a barrier that you're better off going and saying, we're not going to hold people out. We're actually going to give you more players.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a brilliant sort of change of language, and I think we're all becoming, thinking about how we're becoming a bit more positive. If we go back to even, talk about low back pain, chronic pain, our whole language in the physio clinic is now changing in the last 10, 15 years. We're not making things so anatomical and I guess fatalistic, or being really being brought, choosing our words really carefully. And I think that then needs to also overflow, and that perform message, that's what coaches want to hear. Speaking to athletes and coaches all the time, they don't want to talk about injuries. One they sort of glaze over and sort of think, that's not me, that I'm not medical, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a physio, that's probably got, I'm not there. And a lot of people don't want to talk about injury too. Those that have had a serious long-term injury, it's the last thing they want to sort of talk about these days. But they want to talk about performance, they want to talk about scoring goals, they want to talk about being available for the next game, playing minutes, and all that kind of stuff. So I think that's an important message there for some of our younger early career clinicians, is certainly take a bit more of a positive language to your club when you're talking about this stuff.
And even then, the injury prevention components of like high velocity, so maximum velocity, so sprinting, let's call it sprinting. So just as important as doing, potentially just as important as doing the Nordic, is making sure there's sprinting done during the week.
Yeah.
And so that takes bravery then from the medical staff, because you've got to, like, obviously the closer you get to the fast stuff, then the more likely something could happen.
Yep.
So, but if you don't expose them during the week, then are we setting them up to fail on the weekend? But then if we actually include, if you said, here's these exercises, plus we want them to sprint and to do a bit more, make sure there's enough volume in the session, then you'll see it in the response from the coaches. They get a bit confused to start with, because you're going, hang on, you want them to do this, but you're going to let them sprint, and they come along for the ride with it. So sometimes it's not about going, here's the program, this is what we just need to do. It's about going, this is a component that we can spread across the whole group.
Yep. Yep. I like, we've spoken about this before, like, risk. We often get hung up about risk, and, if we do this program, or sorry, more so less about the program, but, if this player returns back to sport this week, they've got a, 10%, an ACL injured athlete, they've got a 10% chance of re-injuring in the next, 6 months, up to 30%, if they're a younger player within the first 2 years returning back to sport. And it gets scary when we sort of start thinking about, 10% risk, 30% risk. But I love your positivity about this, because, there's a 90% chance they won't get injured. There's a 70% chance they won't get injured too. So we often sort of get caught up with risk. And look, you compare our young people who have had an ACL injury, and, the under 20-year-old group who have a 1 in 3 chance of re-rupturing their graft or having a second ACL injury in the first 1 or 2 years. It's a big jump between them and the adults, like a 3 times jump. But there's also a fair chance that they won't hurt themselves either. It's a greater than 50% chance. It's 70% chance they won't hurt themselves. So it's making sure we as clinicians have really good, meaningful discussions about their readiness to return back to sport, making sure their perform programs are being done to complement their return to sport. I've just probably skipped ahead a little bit, but I think whilst we were there talking about risk, I think that was a nice positive spin on things that I've heard you talk about before.
And I think that's the part where, like, even if we look at it from, like, obviously the drama with an ACL issue is the time, the cost, the time, the burden, so how long you're out for. But we've also got to remember, like, the incidence is actually really low. Like, it actually doesn't happen very often. Like, it's compared to like a hamstring and things like that. So if we're looking at doubling, just say someone has 2 times greater risk or 2 times greater incidence, then it's still a low incidence, or it's still a low risk. So relative to something else. So I think it's like the work done by the recent stuff out of Aspetar, looking at the criteria based stuff by Ruler. Like, there's some really nice pragmatic approaches here that empower us to have, because we can't be absolute anyway. We can't say you've got no risk, and we can't say it's going to happen. We've got to just work within that space. And I think then it becomes that becomes then a much nicer collaborative approach to it. And I think that's the component with risk, is about going, well, there is an implied risk. The only way to have 0 risk is you don't play. So then and normally that's for us, to be honest, most of my conversation with coaches now, we go, if you want no risk, then don't play. But then you can start to go, well, they've got these things, so there's a chance of X, Y, Z, and then it becomes a more collaborative process. But I think, and I can say this because I've done it plenty of times, and I've stuffed it up plenty of times, where we become, they'll be fine, and then they're not, or you go, they won't be fine, and then they know they could, and then they coach and play, and they were fine. So I think there's that element of like I say, it comes with age because you get to a point where you just know how to navigate a bit, but
Mm-hmm.
you have to almost embrace making those mistakes a little
Yep.
bit
Yep.
within common sense around and give yourself permission to not be perfect. That's fine.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's probably just me being on my high horse at the moment is that I think a lot of young clinicians want to be at the top flight of football or soccer or basketball. And it's a pretty hard place to be and make mistakes. You're put in the spotlight really quickly. That's where working with, sub elite teams, junior teams, less professional teams allows you to get that experience and skin in the game. And make those mistakes to learn from. Because I think I've, like you, I've made bucket loads of mistakes in my career, and I still make them. But I'm much better at handling those mistakes better now as well. I don't sort of run off and try and hide in the closet anymore. Like I basically stand up to mistakes and own them. Whereas early on in the career, it was it was tough. But that's something that young career clinicians, early career clinicians probably just need to be a bit more motivated. I've seen unfortunately a bit of a trend where there's been less excitement to go and cover junior sport.
Yeah.
Here we are, 40-year-olds up on our high horse, Matt. These bloody, alphas and Gen Zs. They need to
Uh,
get out there and get a bit more skin in the game.
the way I would approach it, and this is like, it's no different to an athlete. Like these are, if we're, if for every game you cover as a physio, whether it's football, rugby league, whatever, like that's a data point. So something's going to
Yep.
happen in there that you
Mm.
will see, and then they'll either get through it or they don't. So then you will learn over time how to deal in those scenarios. So you can, in a community-based sport, the risk of like you can call a game off, no problem, not moving someone with a suspected spinal load. But then again, but also for those early career physios, making sure there's a good support network around you so that there's a phone a friend concept. So
Yep.
who can I call? So for me, and all of our like younger physios, because I'm old, like they've always got my number. If they're unsure about what to do, you just stop and you call me. Like it's no
Mm.
problem. So I think there's a yeah, I think there needs you can't shortcut that because
No.
you have to have the data points in there to then get to a point where you can make the decisions. But then and also know what you can and can't do and have and more
Yep.
it's about being inclusive. So yeah, I
Yep.
think I would always encourage people to learn in the safe zone and everyone
Yep.
a lot of people chase the polo shirt and I get it, it's fine.
Yep.
But it's more about like you'll have a much happier and better, more successful. And to be honest, the players benefit more when you've
Yep.
had a bit of grounding through that space.
Yeah, agree. Sorry, mate, we digressed a
I
bit there,
know
but
we go on tangents anyway. Off my soapbox.
how about plyometrics? We've talked about strength and their involvement. What's your experience there with having plyometrics included in ACL? I know we talk about injury prevention programs as a whole, but
Yep.
it's knock-on effect to ACL prevention or reduction. What have you seen there in that space, and what have you I guess experienced with the inclusion of plyometrics?
Yeah, so within the Perform Plus, like the 11 Plus, there is plyometric, and most of the programs have had been investigated. There is a plyometric component. I think I guess at its rawest, like you've got this ability to produce force over time. So there's that power element, and obviously and I think there's two ways I look at it. So obviously there's a performance arm to it. So there's the plyometric inclusion of plyometrics will improve the performance of the player or the
Yep.
athlete. The other part too is if they're struggling with plyometrics, then it's likely that their joint is not happy to do it. So it becomes almost a screening tool in itself. So what I would always encourage so plyometrics can be a learned task. So yes, persistence is important, but also have a low threshold to bin them, reduce back, and then progress back up again. So
Yeah.
the inability to perform a good plyometric action could be a sign that that knee joint's just not comfortable with what you're doing to it.
Yeah.
So therefore, we need to take a step back, give it more time, then off you go. I tend to find if we listen to the player, listen to the athlete, and sort of really like most athletes will tell you everything you need to know. You've just got to be open enough to listen to it and then start to work backwards about where that could be coming from. It's unlikely that an athlete who's trying to do a plyometric action is unlikely to be unmotivated because it's a
Yeah.
scary action. I think that's the other part too, is we have to understand how scary plyometrics are for people coming back from ACLs
Yeah.
and then make it safe for them to do it. And then and it can be the other part we've done a bit more is rather than dosing them we might start with really small doses. We might just start with one
Mm.
repetition make them feel safe. And then you're getting towards, it might take you 2 weeks to get to the dose that you wanted to do 2 weeks ago, but it could be that you're just doing one every session or two every session and then build your way up that way. So I think you can sort of block it into remember, it's a neural component. It's a scary component for people coming back, but it's
Yeah.
also it can give you a lot of information about, I was going to say joint health, but that's too broad, but just how well the knee is comfortable to absorb the load, or how well your kinetic chain is willing to absorb that load.
Yeah, yeah, awesome. And then from a primary prevention perspective, you've seen the benefits there. You aware of any evidence off the top of your head about like having it included versus not included? Sorry to put you on the spot if you don't.
No, I'm trying to think. My instinct is to say yes, because most of there would be. I think a lot of like the biomechanics based studies
Yeah,
around the sort of the valgus sort of stress and the valgus knee control. A lot of that was around then saying having exercise programming would then change that. And I guess that's the 11 plus programs. A lot of it was going, well, here's all the studies around the individual stuff, let's bring it into one place.
Yes.
So everything has a purpose. I can't think off the top of my head the exact papers, but I'm positive there was a fair bit of around, especially around the biomechanics space, about changes of risk factors based around landing and jumping based programs.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. Like, to have, yes, strength is always nice, but strength will only get you so far on a field. Like all sports, basketball, netball, soccer, there's that explosiveness, that deceleration, the acceleration. So if we're going to basically come up with our own version of an injury, say like you play hockey or you play a sport that actually doesn't have an off the shelf recipe of exercises, it makes sense to try and adapt a jumping landing task or a couple of them into your warm-up strategy. So you've got like a sport specific thing, but I think having that plyometric drill certainly pays dividends to help assist in that injury risk reduction. Cool, mate. Well, I've probably absorbed a fair bit of time. Just a couple more. I think with your role with the Matildas and seeing the growth of female sport, have you seen anything specific? Knowing that the burden of ACL injuries in females here, there was some data from Nirav Maniar, really important paper published a couple of years ago that showed the projection of ACL injuries here in Australia was going to a catastrophic space into the stratosphere. I was trying to say, like we're going to see. What was the figures between the ages of 10 and 14? It was going to be a 10% annual injury risk each year, growing annual incidents till 2030. So it was watching and reading these graphs, like ACL injuries, young females, boom, just absolutely going out of the park. Your work in female sport of late, have you seen anything in particular change, or are you guys doing anything specifically with Matildas to try and mitigate that risk? Is it footwear? Is it looking at general health and wellness? Is it looking at sleep? Are you looking at diet? Are you looking at hormonal kind of changes through the cycle? What's your kind of take at the moment, and what are you guys implementing, if anything?
So I think to give some context, so within the national team setting, the players exist with their clubs most of the time, and then they come into us. So in terms of specific stuff with specifically the Matildas, then nothing necessarily. Obviously, there's a discussion around it, and we're aware of components, but most of it's around continue to have good communication with their clubs and trying to promote. Like from my end, it's around ensuring they have the capacity, the players have the capacity to do what's been asked of them at the club or within the country, the readiness to perform, so where they're up to freshness wise versus their fitness component with their capacity, and then their health, where they're up to health wise. I think most of if they've got to the Matildas level, then they've probably survived most of the components. So a lot of the components for us is around the youth space, like the 17s and the 20s, and that's where a lot of our focus will be. I guess for me, the main component is the narrative, I guess, at the moment around the female player, where there's enough research to show there's a higher risk of ACL injuries in females than there are in male players. Now, the issue with that is that is it because they're a female, or is it
Mm.
because of other factors related to them being female?
Yep.
And that's probably where I sit with most of the stuff at the moment in terms of
Yep. Yep.
going until we achieve apples to apples
Yep.
scenarios around strength and conditioning, resourcing, pitch surfaces, access to care around them. When do we start them with strength and conditioning components? Coaching components, and making sure that we provide them with the same things as the male players get,
Yep.
then I think I'm always cautious of this creating this
Yep.
fragility model where the female
Yep.
player is a fragile person, and
Yep.
that this probably comes into the hormonal stuff around the menstrual cycle component, where at the moment for me to design a study that actually shows that a specific date in the menstrual cycles and a higher risk of an ACL injury is it's going to be very, very tricky to ever run that program.
Yep. Yep.
And I think then you go, well, what are you going to do about that? Because if that high risk day of a low risk of injury anyway, but potentially a high burden, is falls on the World Cup final day, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
Um,
Yep.
and I think that the providing that doesn't mean we ignore menstrual cycle and as around from menstrual health. I think that's a different beast.
Mm.
And I think the current narrative and discussions is important discussions. But I think the linkage into specific injuries is a tenuous one, and it's sort of one
Yep.
that's mainly because we have so many other things to work on in that
Yes.
space.
Yep.
So from my end, and Stella Fight, which she did a great editorial on BJSM around the greenhouse concept, around providing the support network that the players need as a collective, whether that's strength and conditioning support, expertise. That's the other component too, is how do we get the same expertise levels to these players as potentially the men's have. That's not to say they don't get it, but are we evaluating those components? And then you have the scenario where there's been such a rapid rise in the female game where they're playing a lot more minutes than they were. The squad
Yep.
sizes are smaller, so you've got players playing a lot more minutes. So there's a lot of new things happening there, which are number one, far more controllable than the menstrual cycle, because the menstrual cycle, assuming it all goes nicely for the individual, should just be there in the background,
Mm.
and should just be that's normal for them. So the things we can change, make sure that we've got those under control: strength,
Yep.
health, happiness, freshness, those components, and
Yep.
then making sure their environment is set up to support them as individuals. And that's where the, say, nutrition component comes in. What does each individual player need? That's not to say that's not linking nutrition to ACL. That's just for them as the individual. If we get them strong, robust, healthy, happy, ready to do what they need to be able to do, and they're fit enough, then potentially the risk goes down. So that's kind of where I focus on the moment, because I think there's some really low hanging fruit we can work on in that space.
Yep. Yep. No, that's awesome and great points too. I'll share in the notes to all the people watching and listening to this the some really important papers. That paper that you talked about with Stella, and also to Joanne Parsons,
Yeah.
paper from a couple of years ago looking at the gender difference of ACL injury and how that has certainly that for me was an important paper. It really opened my eyes to the big disconnect that exists between male and female athletes. And what you said before, at the moment, we don't have an apples versus apples scenario where, we can't blame biomechanics. We can't blame, hormonal differences. We can't blame these other, what were basically previously set as modifiable, risk factors, intercondylar notches and ACL width and all these kind of things, and all these things that we're trying to blame for the increased risk of ACL injuries. That until we've got a level playing field where female athletes do get provided all those same resources and services as you mentioned before, when that happens, if and when that happens, then we can have like a true, all right, what's going on here? We could have a true study about it. At the moment, that doesn't exist, but it's important we shine a light on it and try to bring that service up to the female athletes.
And I think what we're seeing at the moment is you've got it's getting closer and closer to equality. So that
Yep.
in a lot of scenarios, we're seeing the female players getting the same as the men's players.
Yep.
Now we've got to get to equity, which is like, what do those female players need
Yep.
in their space? So it's not, it won't ever be good enough to go, yeah, this is what we give the men, so this is exactly what you get as a female player. We need to actually then work out what the female players need. And I think that's those are biomechanical risk factors. That's not to say they don't exist. It's just to say, look, we know that if you do things like the Perform Plus or the 11 Plus, there's a fair chance we reduce the impact of those risk factors. I think that's the component. There is some really easy things, easy wins we can put in place. And then there is ongoing research required, absolutely. But in terms of then making sure we do the basic stuff and the cheap stuff, because all that's quite cheap, and then investing in expertise, and then continuing to promote players around the health component. I think then we get to quite a nice place for them, and especially around the equity component, around what the actual individual players need. I don't think we have those answers yet, and then we can continue to develop that over time.
Yep. Awesome. All right, mate. Last one before I let you go. You've probably got some very busy things to do, mate, being a very busy man. Mate, thanks once again for all your time for today. I've really appreciate it. One final thing, I always ask this one. What would be one key message you could share with any early career clinician, even senior clinician that's tuning in today and listening? What would be a key message to share the ACL Hub community about ACL injury prevention?
I think the key is communication and connection. So, and that sounds like so from a science person who's done, like we can have all the knowledge, but if we can't deliver it across to the stakeholders that we're trying to talk to, and the stakeholders are players, parents, coaches, organizations, and your message may be different across all of those things. So, and really, I do see it, and I don't know if it's newish, but it probably has always been there, but really making sure that you listen to the player, listen to the athlete that's in front of you, because they will tell you pretty much all the things you need to know. But I'm starting to see a little bit of a trend, and maybe because I'm just getting old, this is a soapboxing around where we kind of go, the players are this or the athletes that's like, no, like work with the player. You don't have to pull them up. You don't have to push them forward. Just walk next to them. And then come along for the journey, but you have to invest time in building that connection. You don't have to be friends, but you definitely have to learn what connects for that individual player, athlete.
Yep. Awesome. Great messages, mate. Well, thanks very much once again, mate. You've been a wealth of knowledge, and I've always, whenever we catch up, always learn a few little bits of information, mate. So it's been a pleasure having you on board, and thanks to my ACL Hub community for tuning in and listening, and hopefully you guys have learned something today too. So until next time and the next episode, we'll see you guys next time.